Thank you very much for inviting me. Coming out on a Saturday afternoon. So my title is How Christian is Decolonisation. There are links with the general theme of the day. So I am considering decolonisation from a Christian point of view, and on certain occasions I will be explicitly or implicitly Protestant. But there's a sense in which decolonisation in some reaches is an orthodoxy, and it attracts zealots, and zealots can be, in the promotion of decolonisation, very authoritarian, in my experience, and I'm expressing a protest against it. So 4 years ago, the acting Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge University, Dr. Anthony Wheeling, made a confession. He confessed that he was baffled by decolonisation because the word, he said, has been misused to such an extent that I don't think, if I'm honest, I can give an accurate definition. I think many will sympathise with his bafflement, as did I. Because decolonisation can mean a variety of different things, some of which make good sense, but others very bad sense indeed. And the bad ones smuggle themselves into university departments under cover of the good. What I'm going to do is I'm going to analyse decolonisation into different species, and I'm going to focus on what I regard as the most dangerous. The original and most natural home of decolonisation is in former British colonies. And there it can mean something entirely reasonable. For example, in 1986, the Kenyan novelist and playwright Ngugi wa Thiong'o published a book with the title Decolonising the Mind, in which he argued that African literature should be written in African languages, such as his own Kikuyu. Why? So that Africans could recover a sense of self-respect and stop being enthralled with the assumption that whatever comes out of Europe is better. And it seems to me that no Christian believing in the equality of all human beings, regardless of race, and in the creaturely limits and sinful distortions of all human cultures, including Europe's, if really no Christian could possibly disagree with that. When translated out of its original post-colony context and into contemporary Britain, decolonisation can still make some good sense. It can mean correcting the neglect in school curricula of the history of immigration and the contribution of immigrants to this country, for example. Or it can mean that important texts that have been excluded from reading lists in schools and universities just because of prejudice against the race of their authors should be included. If it's true that the history of immigration and the multicultural reality of Britain has been neglected, and if it's true that important texts have been excluded just because of the skin colour of the author, then of course curricula should be decolonised, if those things are true. So far, so reasonable. Less reasonable, however, is the opposition of decolonisers to Eurocentricity and their insistence on shifting attention to non-European histories and cultures. On the contrary, I think a certain Eurocentricity in British education is entirely justified. Britain is not anywhere. We are located in Northwest Europe. We have a particular history. We have developed particular institutions and traditions. It's vitally important, therefore, that school education, at least, should focus on helping budding citizens understand the immediate cultural and political environment in which they stand and for which they're about to become directly responsible. Of course, once at university, students can throw off Eurocentricity to their heart's content and immerse themselves completely in African culture, Indian history, or Chinese language, if they so wish. Also unreasonable, I think, is the claim that school and university reading lists should contain an ethnic diversity of authors so that an ethnic diversity of students can identify with them. I say this because it seems to me manifestly untrue that people of a certain race can only relate to, understand, be inspired by, and learn from someone of the same race. White Britons have been admiring the Semitic Jesus for 2 millennia, and the Indian Mahatma Gandhi for over a century. And judging by the occasion on Christchurch's high table 15 years ago, when I found myself surrounded by an unlikely troupe of Shakespearean actors in Kabul, Afghans are perfectly capable of appreciating England's most famous dramatist. Most happily, we really aren't intellectually imprisoned in racial silos. And this amounts to empirical corroboration of Christian dogma of the creative nature of things, that since human beings are fellow creatures in a God-given world, they can comprehend universal truths, even when embodied in a foreign culture and voiced by members of different race. Yet another version of decolonisation is not merely unreasonable, but positively dangerous. This is the view that identifies reason, scientific method, and the liberal values of tolerance and free speech as Eurocentric, and therefore manifestations of oppressive Western hegemony that deserves to be pulled down. How much good sense does that make, you think, to the ethnically Chinese students who put their lives and liberty at risk in fighting for liberal rights in Hong Kong 6 years ago? And what exactly is the alternative to reason and tolerance other than arbitrary force? This anti-rational decolonisation is the handmaid of oppressively authoritarian politics. And Christians, humbly aware of the creaturely limits and sinful corruption of all human beings, will appreciate the need for the free and reciprocal testing of ideas, and especially if they are Protestant Christians, they will beware of any authoritarian regime that raises itself above accountability. So, in my view, some kinds of decolonisation make more or less good sense, some bad, but the one that should worry us most, I suggest, is that which tells the following story. Britain is a systemically racist country. Its racism is rooted in its colonial past, which it continues to celebrate, not least in the form of public statues, for example, that of Cecil Rhodes on Oxford High Street. And the epitome, the essence of this colonial past was slavery, in which Britain treated Africans as subhuman. This view of Africans as subhuman expanded into a wholesale disparagement of non-white cultures. Therefore, we Britons need to exercise, to expel this lingering racist mentality by repudiating Britain's colonial heritage. And that's what I call the cultural revolutionary decolonising story that smuggled itself into university departments under cover of more reasonable ideas. And it's a false story, false because every one of its main assumptions is wrong, I think. Now, why I think that I'll explain in a moment, but first of all, let me tell you why I think we should care. Because there are lots of people on the political left and some on the right who think that the present culture wars are either a mendacious distraction or a futile one. And I couldn't disagree more strongly. In my view, the colonial front in the culture war is culturally crucial. And since politics is down to culture, it is politically crucial too. Why? Because what's at stake is the self-confidence of the British, together with the Australians, New Zealanders, and Canadians, and their identity as peoples committed to support and promote Western liberal institutions. first became aware of this when reading about contemporary Scottish nationalism, in spite of my accent, I am Scottish, I'm Anglo-Scottish, and I'm a natural proponent of Scottish independence. And in the during the campaign leading up to the referendum of Scottish independence in 2014, in spite of my opposition to Scottish independence, I felt more obliged to consider nationalist arguments because as a Christian attached to the land, the UK, I don't regard any nation as divine. The nations come and go. The UK didn't exist before 1801. The United States almost didn't exist in the 60s until the party ceased to exist in 1993. So the Scots nationalists might be right, or the Welsh nationalists too. It could be the case that the moral justification for the survival of the UK had run out of steam. So I looked at nationalist arguments for Scottish independence. And one argument that came across can be reduced to this equation. Britain equals empire equals evil. Therefore, the Scots should separate themselves from this evil incubus Britain and sail off into a bright new shiny sin-free future. But because I've been reading British imperial history for 20-odd years, I knew that the simple equation, empire equals evil, is not historically or morally tenable. In his 1930s novel, A Man Without Qualities, which was set in the decline of the Austrian Empire around 1900, Robert Musil wrote, and I quote, "However well-founded an order may be, it always rests in part on a voluntary faith in it. Once this unaccountable and uninsurable faith is used up, the collapse soon follows. Epochs and empires crumble no differently from business concerns when they lose their credit." Scottish nationalism, it seems to me, and indeed what applies to Scottish nationalism applies also to much left-wing progressivism. These have not only abandoned the British Western faith, they actively seek to undermine it. Now, if it were true that Britain's 400-year imperial career as a global power was nothing but a litany of racism, cultural contempt, exploitation, and unwarranted violence, summed up in the perpetration of slavery, then far from identifying with it, we should repudiate it. We should stop trying to uphold the so-called liberal international order. We should stop even trying to keep the UK united. So the reason why the cultural revolutionary story about decolonisation matters is because of the story it tells about Britain's present and past and what it implies for Britain's future. And since I think the story it tells is very largely untrue and even fraudulent, the danger decolonisation poses is that it persuading the British people and their friends and the Canadians to chart a course into the future that is based on a set of falsehoods. In 1976, the Baghdad-born historian, Jewish historian Eli Kaduri published a book in the Anglo-Arab Labyrinth, in which he argued against the belief that Britain had betrayed the Arabs during the First World War, a belief that had come to infect the British Foreign Office. I've read it, unless you're carefully considered in that topic, I wouldn't recommend it. It's very dense, but it is, I think, persuasive. Chapter 7 closes with this sentence, and I quote, "No doubt great powers do commit great crimes, but a great power is not always and necessarily in the wrong, and the canker of imaginary guilt, even the greatest power can ill withstand." The canker of imaginary guilt. Now, Britain, of course, is no longer a great power, but we are still an important power. And we're an important liberal power at a time when illiberal forces in Moscow and Beijing are flexing their brutal authoritarian muscles on the battlefield of Ukraine and across the narrow water from Taiwan. So the reason why cultural revolution and decolonisation matters and why you should care is that it threatens to infect us and undermine our liberal self-confidence and power with the canker of imaginary guilt. flight matters. What I've received, Robert, how much time do you want me to on speaking for?
We have, there's 35 minutes until 5, so it's now 4:25. We have other events, starting up shortly after 5.
Fine.
So as far as I'm concerned, you could speak for 35 minutes exactly, and I won't be keeping track.
Okay, so we'll have time for Q&A, will we?
I expect so. If we ended at 5, we'd have.
I will aim to finish at 5. I can talk for England on this, and I will not talk for England, I promise you. So let me see where I go. I can read it.
Yeah.
So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain to you why I think each of the 3 main assumptions of the cultural revolution in decolonizing story are false. And the first assumption is, yes, it's an assumption, it's not an assumption, is that Britain today is systemically racist. And the issue is an empirical one. It's either true or not. So what are the reasons for doubting this claim? Well, first of all, you may have noticed that the last Boris Johnson government, most of the people in charge of the major departments of the British state were headed by Britons of Middle Eastern, Asian, or African heritage. Most of them did not have white singers. I don't need to go through their names, you name them. And since then, of course, we've also had an ethnically Indian prime minister, and we now have an ethnically African leader for the opposition. So just in terms of, and that's kind of anecdotal, it's not sort of scientific, but white supremacist societies don't do that. They really don't. So that's one indication that perhaps Britain is not systemically racist. If you want more comprehensive social scientific evidence, then look at the 2019 report of the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, being like in the EU, which found that the prevalence of racist harassment as perceived by people of African descent was lower in the UK than in any of the 12 EU countries surveyed, with the sole exception of Malta. And the prevalence of overall racial discrimination in terms of such things as employment, health, or housing was the lowest in the UK, bar none. It also found, by the way, that race relations were worse in Austria, Finland, and Ireland, countries with no history of overseas colonization. Next, there is the March 21 Sewell report of the UK government's Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities. 8 out of whose 9 commissioners were members of ethnic minorities, and whose chairman, Dr. Tony Sewell, was a Jamaican Briton and the descendant of African slaves. And this report argued that while racism certainly persists in Britain, as it does in every society, different socio-economic outcomes for different ethnic groups in Britain have a variety of causes, of which racism is only one. Outcomes vary considerably between different ethnic groups, for example, in secondary education. In secondary education, for example, Chinese and Indian pupils outperform their white British peers, quote, by wide margins. Indeed, when socioeconomic status is controlled for, quote, all major ethnic groups outperform better than white British pupils, except for Black Caribbean pupils. And compared to the US, the attainment gap between white and Black pupils is approximately 8 times smaller. Meanwhile, regarding pay, Chinese and Indian ethnic groups earn more on average than the white British one. Because of this variety in outcomes, the Credit report concludes that the divisive conceptual division of British society into white and Black and minority ethnic should be abandoned, because BAME is far too indiscriminate. There's so many variations among Black and minority ethnic groups. It's not a helpful opposition. The third set of social scientific data that disturbs the decolonizers' claim that British society today is systemically racist is provided by the World Values Survey 2023. which shows Britain to be one of the least racist countries in the world. Only 5% of British respondents objected to having immigrants as neighbours, and only 2% were neighbours of a different race, roughly the same as Norway, Sweden and Germany, and far better than Iran, Russia and China. It's notable that Australia and Canada, both creations of British colonial endeavour, also returned the same some of the lowest scores. So, for all those reasons, I think the first main assumption of the revolutionary decolonising story is not true. So what about the second assumption, that such racism as persists in Britain today is rooted in British colonialism and its epitome, slavery? Well, a very large fly in the ointment of the argument that the essence of British colonialism lay in slavery and the racist contempt it embodied is the fact that the British Empire was the first major power in the history of the world to abolish both the slave trade and slavery in the name of a Christian conviction of the fundamental equality of all human races under God. In the last quarter of the 18th century, anti-slavery sentiment flourished widely among English nonconformists, especially the Quakers, and the Methodists or evangelical wing of the Church of England. John Wesley, Anglican priest and founder of Methodism, prefaced his thoughts upon slavery in 1774 with a quotation of the 10th verse of the 4th chapter of the book of Genesis. And the Lord said, "What hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground." The context, of course, is Cain's murder of his brother Abel, and the implication is clear. African and Englishman, slave and master, are brothers, common children of the same God. This was the racially egalitarian view that triumphed in 1807, when the British Parliament voted to abolish the trade in slaves throughout the empire, and again in 1823, when it voted to abolish the institution of slavery altogether. What's more, from 1807 and throughout the second half of its existence until the 1960s, the empire was committed to suppressing the trade and institution across the world, from Brazil, across Africa, to India and Malaysia. In the 1820s and 30s, the Slave Trade Department was the largest unit in the British Foreign Office. At one point in mid-century, the Royal Navy was deploying over 13% of its total manpower just in suppressing the trade in slaves in West Africa and the Americas. According to the economic historian David Eltis, the British spent as much suppressing the Atlantic trade in the 47 years from 1816 to 62 as they had earned in profits over the same length of time leading up to 1807. According to the American international relations scholars Hein Hauptmann, Robert Pape, Britain's effort to suppress the Atlantic trade alone in 1807-67 was, and I quote, "the most expensive example of costly international moral action recorded in modern history." So we cannot simply identify British colonialism with slavery and racism, because for the second half of its life, the one closest to us, anti-slavery, not slavery, was at the heart of British imperial policy. And one mark of this discontinuity between the first and second halves of the empire's life is the witness of African Americans in the 19th century. As the American historian of abolition, John Stauffer, has written, and I quote, "Almost every United States black who travelled in the British Isles acknowledged the comparative dearth of racism there. Frederick Douglass, the famous black abolitionist, noted, after arriving in England in 1845, I saw in every man a recognition of my manhood, and an absence, a perfect absence, of everything like the disgusting hate with which we are pursued in the United States." Just over a century later, Desmond Tutu had a similar experience when he first visited Britain in the 1960s. According to the obituary in the Times newspaper in December 2021, and I quote, "It was in Britain that Tutu first began to realise the intrinsic evil of apartheid. Police officers were polite, White people did not take precedence in pews. He visited Lord's, the Royal Albert Hall, and the Travelers Club in Pall Mall. He lost the sense of inferiority that most black South Africans felt in the presence of whites. And he lost it here. Let me be clear, I'm not arguing that the British Empire didn't contain elements of ugly racist contempt for native peoples. It certainly did. But more at the colonial periphery than at the imperial centre, and more among settlers and planters than among colonial officials and missionaries. Nonetheless, the worldwide suppression of slavery was a major policy of the imperial centre, which was sustained for a century and a half, and was premised on the principle, the mainly Christian principle, of the fundamental human equality of all races. Moreover, that principle found further central expression when, at the end of the First World War, the Imperial War Graves Commission committed itself to the equal treatment of all the empire's fallen troops in the commemoration of their sacrifice, whatever their skin colour. As Sir Frederick Kenyon wrote in his seminal 1918 report on the design of war graves and cemeteries, and I quote, "No less honour should be paid to the last resting places of Indian and other non-Christian members of the empire than to those of our British soldiers." 8 years later, the Commission's founder, Sir Fabian Ware, reaffirmed this view, writing that all soldiers of the empire should be treated alike. And this principle was consistently realised in Europe, as you can easily confirm by visiting the Menin Gate at Ypres, where the names of Indians with no known grave join British ones in cascading down the tragic walls. Or the cemetery at Noailles-sur-Mer, where the burials of members of the Chinese Labour Corps are marked by individual headstones, just like those of British and Irish soldiers elsewhere. The main point here is you cannot trace a continuous line through the British Empire from the racist enslavement of Africans in the 18th century to present racism, to discontinuity. Now we reach the third and final assumption of the revolutionary decolonising story, namely that British colonial racism manifested itself in a general wholesale disparagement of the cultures of non-white peoples and of the unwelcome position of white culture upon them. White culture, of course, including Christianity. To begin with, let's just remember that human cultures are constantly in the business of learning and borrowing from each other. They don't sit in racial silos, hermetically sealed against one another. For obvious example, Christianity, the religion that has done most to shape European culture, wasn't invented in Europe. It arose in the Middle East among Semitic people who didn't speak a Romance or Teutonic or Slavic language and whose skin colour wasn't pink. And when British and other missionaries brought a Europeanized version of that Semitic religion to Africa, they didn't have the power to impose it. But they didn't have to, because with its message of the brotherhood of man and equality in Christ, Christianity proved naturally attractive to African refugees, slaves, children, marginalized adults such as women, and repressed teenagers such as girls fleeing compulsory circumcision. Yet if Africans adopted Christianity, they also adapted it. They didn't follow the European version wholesale and passively. They acted upon it and Africanized it. Famously in Kenya, many African Christians refused to accept the European missionary prohibition on polygamy, and so they set up their own independent African churches. Human cultures are constantly giving and taking, adopting and adapting. To divide the world into simplistic, static, white and black cultural blocks is just not intelligent. So the idea that each culture has some natural moral monopoly in its own creations and that cultural appropriation is a form of theft is absurd. If that were true, everyone in this room now wearing trousers would owe the descendants of the ancient golden Schulz compensation. Far from being contemptuous of the foreign cultures they found themselves in, British Empire builders were often fascinated by them. There's a fellow called John Malcolm, who I have taken a particular interest in because he was born about 60 miles east of where I grew up in southwest Scotland. He was the son of a tenant farmer in the mid-1700s. And young John left home at the age of 12 with a parochial school education and travelled south because his father had gone bankrupt and couldn't afford to feed his 17 children. So there's young John in the early 1770s. He lived down to London at age 12, and he signed up to join the Madras Army of the East India Company. And then a year later, age 13, he sailed to India, where he stayed for 40 years. While in India, he became fascinated by Persia. He learnt Persian language, Farsi. He led 3 diplomatic missions to the Shah of Persia, and he wrote a history of Persia that Goethe is known to have borrowed 3 times from Weimar State Library, and which, thanks to Cambridge University Press, still in print. Indeed, far from pressing down, according to the Indian man of letters Neeraj Chowdhury, the British Orientalists raised up, because in rescuing classical Sanskritic civilization from oblivion, people like Warren Hastings and Sir William Jones, and I quote, rendered a service to Indian and Asiatic nationalism which no native could ever have given. At one stroke, it put the Indian nationalist on a par with his English ruler. It gave him a material out of which to build the historical myth of a Hindu civilization that was superior to Europe's. If some Britons were keen to rescue Sanskritic culture, some Indians were desperate to jettison it. In 1823, Raja Ram Mohan Roy wrote to Lord Amherst, the Governor-General of India, the East India Company had been planning to invest in building a new college in Calcutta to recover and preserve and promote ancient classical Sanskrit learning. Ram Mohan Roy was a Hindu social reformer, and he objected strongly. He described Sanskrit learning as, quote, the best calculated to keep this country in darkness. Instead of investing in Sanskritic culture, he urged the British to promote the education of, quote, the natives of India in mathematics, natural philosophy, chemistry, anatomy, and other useful sciences, which the nations of Europe have carried to a degree of perfection that has raised them above the inhabitants of other peoples of the world. Just to be clear, that's an Indian writing, not a Brit. Just if you are interested in this remarkable man, Mohan Roy, he came to England to lobby in favour of the East India Company banning sati, the Indian custom of whereby widows burn themselves alive in the funeral pyres of the deceased husbands, and he died, as it happens, in what's now a suburb of Bristol, where he lies buried, and there was a statue raised to him there, grave in 1987. Again, I'm not saying that in addition to elements of bona fide curiosity and admiration, the empire didn't contain elements of cultural repression, born of political fear or of race contempt. It did. I think of the repression of Gaelic culture in Ireland and Scottish Highlands, for example. Nonetheless, this needs to be distinguished in a way that talk of cultural genocide does not distinguish from well-intentioned policies of native assimilation to British culture. When the people of one culture meets another and dominates it overwhelmingly in number and power, only 3 outcomes are possible. Either the dominant people annihilates the dominated one, or the latter adapts and assimilates, or the 2 peoples separate. It's either annihilation, or assimilation, or apartheid. British colonial settlement did sometimes inadvertently cause the annihilation of the native people, as in the case of the Beothuk of Newfoundland. The third option, separation, of which the Afrikaner apartheid or separateness is a version, Apartheid was never British imperial policy. Whether in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, or South Africa, that policy was basically assimilation, even when provisional separation was countenanced. The egalitarian view that native people were essentially equal to Britons possessed of the equal potential to develop economically and culturally, predominated in the imperial metropolis, even when some settlers on the colonial periphery doubted it. Politics of assimilation usually involves such things as the creation of land reserves, the provision of native schools, and the promotion of agriculture. The consignment of Native Americans or Maori to reserves did involve provisional separation, of course, but only to shield them from being overwhelmed by too rapid change, while they learned to adapt. The goal of assimilation was the full integration of native peoples into European society as equal citizens, which is why, in South Africa's Cape Colony, black Africans were granted the vote on the same terms as whites in 1853. In New Zealand, all adult Maori males were granted the vote before whites in 1867. Now, their native counterparts in Eastern Canada were granted in 1885 by the Conservative John A. Macdonald. 9 years later, the Wilfrid Premier, the Liberal Premier Wilfrid Laurier reversed that and took the vote away from the Native Canadians because they were all voting Tory. By its very nature, cultural assimilation involves change. It involves letting go of at least some of the old and taking hold of at least some of the new. One of the benefits of imperial rule in Australia, New Zealand, and Southern Africa was the ending of endemic intertribal warfare. Now, the ending of persistent war is good, but it does entail the redundancy of warriors. Young Aboriginal, Maori, and Bantu men had to learn a new way of life because the old one was gone from them. And on the western prairies of Canada, the sudden collapse of the bison population in the 1880s through indigenous overexploitation meant that the economic basis for traditional native life vanished. Indigenous Canadians had to change in order to survive, and they knew it, which is why their chiefs insisted on the provision of schools when they were negotiating the so-called numbered treaties in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And well into the 20th century, they were lobbying for more residential schools. Yes, the ones currently slandered in the press. They were lobbying for more schools where their children would be immersed in English language and learn a settled agricultural way of life. Now, the assimilation sufficient for survival and flourishing in the new future needn't have involved the wholesale jettisoning of the past. It could have been discriminate, too often it wasn't. Some white Christian teachers of native children were indiscriminately disparaging of their traditional culture to a racist extent. That was wrong and lamentable. The main point still stands. The British Empire's policies of assimilation were intended to rescue native people from a past that was irrecoverable so that they might flourish in a future that was unavoidable, and that they might do so as equal citizens. So in some as I see it, the revolutionary decolonizing story is wrong in all three of its main assumptions. Britain today is not systemically racist. Indeed, it's one of the least racist countries in the world. Such racism as persists among us is not rooted in British colonialism. It spent the second half of its life committed to anti-slavery, out of the Christian conviction of the basic human equality of all races. And third, British imperialists were not generally inclined to rubbish the cultures of non-white peoples, and non-white peoples were not generally inclined to resent what the British brought them. Often they welcomed it, even while they adapted what they adopted. Finally, as I've indicated, and as still I hope, Christians have several dogs in the fight over decolonisation. And they have a particular interest in the cultural revolutionary narrative because the reputation of Christian churches and missions is bound up with the reputation of British colonialism. But Christians have another important interest, not in the content of the fight over decolonisation, but in its manner. On several occasions, I have suggested critical analysis what some decolonizing historians have written. And let me give you one example. Richard Drayton, Professor of Imperial and Global History at King's College London, who I discovered when I was setting that in August 2019, had created a whole book chapter to me on me as an icon of Brexit, even though I voted to remain. And when I discovered this, I then decided to write a report to Richard Drayton under the title of the Drayton Icon and Intellectual Vice. I won't burden you with all the evidence I used to substantiate my argument, but here's the conclusion I wrote then. As we've seen, Richard Drayton's thinking has taken the form of a false interpretation of data, several gratuitous and malicious ad hominem insinuations, a host of misrepresentations, the pulling of professional rank, irrelevant pleasantry, distorting caricatures, and a complete failure to engage carefully and rationally with what I actually say. Thereby, it's given expression to the following intellectual vices: carelessness, injustice, uncharity, hubris, and evasiveness. Evidently, these are motivated by a zealous political hostility that so possesses him as to rob him of reason and scruple. This zeal will not brook contradiction. He won't entertain the possibility that it might be mistaken. So instead of letting a contrary position stand, observing it carefully, doing it justice, and letting it provoke thought, which risks giving rise to doubt, has to be manhandled into the shape of a risible straw man to be brushed aside with ease. The problem that Richard Drayton illustrates, however, is not just narrowly academic, but more broadly public. For sure, the intellectual vices that he and his allies exhibit destroy the possibility of fruitful dialogue with academic colleagues like me. For no useful purpose can be served by trying to converse with people whose objections are unconstrained by the basic rule of civility, who will not listen, who can't do justice, and who are too insecure to risk thought. Under those conditions, to attempt communication merely invites heat, not light. But much, much worse are the wider public ramifications. This is because generations of students who pass through the zealous hand of Drayton and his ilk will be rewarded for sharing their prejudices and imitating their vices. And then today's students will become tomorrow's citizens, voters, journalists, MPs, and political leaders. So if we care about the future of rational public discourse among us, and if we care to keep political conflict within civilized bounds, then we should start to worry about the illiberal likes of the Rhodes Professor of Imperial History. We should start to ask university leaders to justify their rewarding, promoting, and funders their supporting politically corrosive intellectual vice that harms us all. Now, the intellectual vices I've observed in Richard Drayton's writing are by no means confined to him. The shocking lack of intellectual virtue among some historians of empire and colonialism I've encountered, I present methodically in my next book. Given that phenomenon, I think one of the most important contributions that Christians, Protestant and otherwise, can make to academic and public controversy over history and other cultural issues is to develop, exercise, and model the intellectual and social virtues that are vital in keeping controversy civil. These are virtues such as courage in the face of ideas that are alien and threatening, strict justice in representing them, charity in construing their ambiguities, preferring the strongest rather than the weakest possibility, docility in admitting the possibility that they might have something to teach, humility in admitting the possibility of correction by them, forbearance and temperance in the face of the unfairness and provocation that opponents may perpetrate. And above all, such a love for the truth that will keep on saying it, prophesying it, in the face of hostility. And not all these virtues are uniquely Christian, but they are truly and authentically so. and they are rarely mentioned in contemporary Western culture, where rights talk so dominates as to push almost every other kind of moral category off the table. That's not to say that no one intuits virtue or exercises it, but it is to say that talk about it is so repressed that it's difficult to name. Being it difficult to name, it's difficult to identify, to communicate, and to promote. The result is that vice flourishes unopposed, not least among some university professors and teachers. Therefore, by developing, displaying, and naming intellectual virtues in the midst of the fractious cultural war over decolonisation, Christians have a very important role to play in giving voice to them and reminding their fellow citizens of their crucial public importance.